The scent of burning pine was the first warning. It came on the wind, a bitter perfume that choked the gentle fragrance of damp earth and night-blooming moon petal. Raisa's hands stilled over the worn wooden bowl in her lap, the simple act of shelling river pearls forgotten. A deep primal tremor went through her, a vibration of wrongness that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. For 5 years, this forest had been her sanctuary, a silent world where the ghosts of her past could not follow. But the ghost had learned to ride on smoke and steel. The clang of armor followed the scent, a rhythmic, metallic heartbeat growing closer, devouring the peace she had bled to build. She looked up at the silver-white moon, a silent witness hanging in the ink-black sky, and knew her borrowed time was over. He had found her. The first scream ripped through the quiet settlement of cobbled-together huts and lodges. It was a sound of pure terror, followed by the splintering crash of a door kicked from its hinges. Raisa was on her feet in an instant, the bowl clattering to the ground, its contents scattering like pale, fallen teeth. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drumbeat of panic. She was not a warrior. She was an exile, a broken thing, a shifter whose wolf had been silenced the day she was cast out. All she had was the instinct to flee. She bolted from her small cabin, her bare feet silent on the packed earth. The air, once cool and clean, was now thick with the acrid stench of torched thatch and the coppery tang of fear. Soldiers in black iron plate bearing the Vascan crest, the snarling dire wolf, moved with brutal efficiency, their swords glinting in the firelight. They were not killing, she realized with a sickening lurch. They were hurting. The small population of exiles, outcasts, and runaways who had carved out a life in this forgotten stretch of the northern wilds were being forced into the central clearing, their faces stark with confusion and horror. Raisa ducked behind a stack of firewood, her breath catching in her throat. She could run. The deep woods were her home now. She knew every shadow, every hollow, but she saw the face of an old woman, the settlement's healer, her eyes wide with terror as a guard shoved her forward. She saw a young boy, no older than 10, crying silently as he was torn from his mother's grasp. These people had taken her in when she was nothing, a half-dead, mute creature crawling from the jaws of a winter storm. They had shown her a kindness she had never known in the cold, gilded halls of the royal court. Leaving them to this fate felt like a betrayal worse than the one that had sent her here. "Find her," a voice cut through the chaos, cold and sharp as obsidian. "The king wants her untouched." The voice belonged to a captain, his face a mask of grim duty, but standing beside him were figures whose presence made the blood freeze in Raisa's veins. Lord Malachor. His silver hair shone like a death shroud in the firelight, his handsome face twisted with a mixture of triumph and apprehension. Beside him stood others from the High Council, the same wolves who had watched her public humiliation, who had nodded in assent as the old king's heir rejected her, his words a lash against her soul. They had come to witness the final act of her destruction. Raisa pressed herself deeper into the shadows, a sob of pure, helpless rage building in her chest. Why now? After 5 years of silence, of believing herself forgotten, a ghost in their memory, why drag her back into the light? The circle of soldiers tightened. There was no escape. Taking a shuddering breath, she stepped out from behind the woodpile, her chin held high. Her simple linen dress was smudged with dirt, her long dark hair unbound and tangled with bits of leaf and twig. She was a creature of the wilds, not the polished courtier they remembered. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cower. Every head turned. A hush fell over the clearing, broken only by the crackle of the flames. The soldiers parted, creating a path through the terrified captives. At the far end of that path, emerging from the oppressive darkness between the trees, a new figure appeared. He was mounted on a war horse the color of midnight, a beast so massive it seemed born of nightmare. The man who sat astride it was even more imposing. Arendor. He was no longer the prince she had loved in secret, the boy with warm hands and a laugh that could chase away the shadows. This was a king, clad in black leather and steel that seemed to absorb the light. He was a figure of absolute power. A thick, fur-lined cloak was draped over his broad shoulders, and the hilt of a greatsword rose above his right shoulder. A jagged scar, pale and stark against his tanned skin, cut from his left temple down across his cheekbone, a permanent mark of some battle she could not imagine. He had the same dark hair, the same strong jaw, But his eyes, they were no longer the color of the summer sky. They were chips of ice, cold and merciless, and they were fixed on her. The aura of him washed over the clearing, a crushing weight of dominance and fury that made the very air feel thin. The soldiers bowed their heads, the court lords shuffled their feet, their earlier smugness evaporating into visible uneaten. Even the fires seemed to burn a little lower in his presence. He dismounted in one fluid, predatory motion, his boots making no sound on the scorched earth. He moved toward her, each step a deliberate, measured beat in the silent funeral march of her freedom. The crowd of exiles melted away from her, a subconscious reaction to the sheer lethality rolling off him in waves. Soon she stood alone in the center of the clearing, trapped in the unforgiving glacier of his gaze. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the scent of horse, leather, and the unique masculine scent of him that was threaded with something new and dangerous, ozone, like a coming storm. "Raisa Dalen," he said. His voice was deeper than she remembered, a low rumble that vibrated through the ground, through her very bones. It held no warmth, no trace of the boy who had once whispered her name like a prayer in the moonlight. Accused of treason, found guilty of conspiring against the crown, rejected and exiled. He was reciting her crimes for the benefit of the assembled court, for the pack that had discarded her. Each word was a perfectly aimed stone, striking the bruises of her past. She flinched but did not look away. Her muteness, a curse that had befallen her during the trauma of her rejection, was a shield now. She could not beg, she could not plead. She could only meet his gaze and let him see the unbroken woman she had become. Lord Malachor stepped forward slightly, a sycophantic smile touching his lips. "Your Majesty, we have her. She can be dealt with according to the old laws." "Silence!" Arendor snapped without taking his eyes off Raisa. Malachor froze, the smile dying on his face, a flicker of fear in his eyes. Arendor's gaze dropped, sweeping over her worn dress, her bare feet, her calloused hands. A muscle tightened in his jaw. It might have been anger. It might have been something else entirely. 5 years I gave you, he murmured, his voice now dangerously soft, for her ears alone. 5 years of peace in this hovel. Did you think I had forgotten? Raisa's heart fractured. He thought this was a gift? This life, scraped from the dirt at the edge of the world, was a mercy he had granted her? The sheer arrogance of it was a slap in the face. A fire she had thought long extinguished flickered to life in her soul, pure, unadulterated fury. He saw it in her eyes. A faint, cruel smile touched his lips. "Good," he whispered. "I would be disappointed if the wilderness had tamed you completely." Then his hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her upper arm. His grip was like iron, inescapable. He turned, dragging her with him to the center of the clearing, forcing her to face the delegation from the court. Malachor, the elders, the faces of her tormentors. Their expressions were a mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning horror. This was not the quiet execution they had anticipated. "You all bore witness to her rejection," Arendor's voice boomed, carrying to every corner of the clearing. "You watched as my brother cast her out, declared her unworthy, unclean. You nodded and called it justice." He paused, letting the weight of his condemnation settle. "You were wrong." With a sudden, brutal shove, he forced her to her knees. The rough, scorched earth bit into her skin. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over her. It was happening again, a public spectacle, with her as the centerpiece of shame. She squeezed her eyes shut, refusing to cry, refusing to give him the satisfaction. She felt him move behind her. His large hands settled on her shoulders, holding her in place. She could feel the heat of his body, the solid wall of his chest at her back. His scent enveloped her, pine, storm, and a possessive musk that spoke of the dominant alpha wolf. "A bond once forged by the goddess cannot be unmade by the whims of lesser wolves," he declared, his voice a low, threatening growl. "It can only be broken or reclaimed." He tilted her head back, his fingers tangling in her hair, forcing her neck to the side, baring the delicate skin just below her ear. She trembled, a violent, uncontrollable shudder. She knew what was coming, the claiming mark, the most sacred, most permanent bond between shifters. It was meant to be a gift, an act of love and devotion exchanged between true mates. What he was doing was an act of war, It was possession. Punishment. His lips brushed against her skin, a feather-light touch that was a shocking counterpoint to the violence of his grip. A strangled sound escaped her throat. It wasn't a word, just a broken noise of protest and despair. "This is not a prize," he growled against her ear, his hot breath sending a shiver of dread and something horribly familiar down her spine. "This is a leash so that you never run again." Then his teeth sank into her flesh. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded through her. It was a primal agony, a tearing and searing that went deeper than skin and muscle. It struck her soul, but beneath the pain, something else erupted. An ancient, dormant magic flared to life within her. A faint, silvery tracery of a mark, one he had given her in a secret ceremony years ago. A promise whispered under a summer moon, blazed into existence under his new one. It was a connection she had thought severed forever. A torrent of power, raw and overwhelming, flooded the bond between them. It was his power, the might of an alpha king, but it was met by a current from her, a dormant wellspring she never knew she possessed. The bond didn't just form, it detonated. She screamed, a raw, ragged sound torn from a throat that had been silent for 5 years. She felt the moment the mark settled, his magic burning his name, his essence, into her very being. The world swam in a haze of agony and ecstasy. Through it, she could feel him, his iron will, his soul-deep rage, his possessive triumph. And beneath it all, a sliver of something that felt terrifyingly like despair. He lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He pulled her roughly to her feet, turning her to face him. His eyes were no longer ice. They were molten silver, the glowing, predatory eyes of his wolf. A trickle of blood ran from the fresh wound on her neck, stark and crimson against her pale skin. He lifted a thumb and wiped it away, his touch almost gentle now, a terrifying contrast to the brutality of the act. The new mark on her neck throbbed with a life of its own, a brand of ownership visible to all. Her own answering mark, hidden beneath her hairline, a faint echo of what they once were, pulsed with a sympathetic fire. He knew. Of course he knew. He could feel it, just as she could feel him. "Now you are mine," Arendor Vaskin said, his voice dropping to a possessive whisper that carried the weight of a royal decree. "Mine to command, mine to protect, mine to punish." He looked past her, his glowing gaze sweeping over the horrified faces of Lord Malachor and the others. "Her exile is over. She returns to the capital as my queen." The silence that followed was absolute, a void of pure shock. Then his eyes met hers again, and he added one final, devastating sentence, meant only for her. "And together we will watch our enemies burn." The journey back was a silent torment. Rhaisa was placed on a mare as black as Arendor's warhorse, its reins held by a grim-faced guard who refused to meet her eyes. She was a ghost being led back to her own tomb. The world moved past in a blur of dark trees and cold stars. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but it was a dull ache compared to the searing, vibrant life of the mark on her neck. It was a brand, a hot pulse against her skin that echoed the furious beat of Arendor's heart. He rode ahead of her, a black silhouette of uncompromising power, his back a rigid wall of steel and authority. Through the new, raw bond, she could feel him. It was an invasion, a violation of the deepest kind. She felt the iron control he clamped over his emotions, a discipline so absolute it was terrifying. But beneath it, like magma churning deep within the earth, was a current of incandescent rage. It wasn't directed at her. It was a vast, sprawling fury aimed at the world, at the men who rode behind them, Malachor and the others, their faces pale and drawn in the moonlight. She could also feel his awareness of her. It was a constant, heavy pressure on her mind, a sense that he knew every shiver that ran down her spine, every flicker of terror and defiance in her soul. They rode for 2 days, stopping only for brief, functional rests. No one spoke to her. The soldiers treated her with a fearful reverence, their gazes skittering away from the raw, red mark on her neck. She was the king's property now, a thing to be handled with care, but not with kindness. She ate the food they gave her without tasting it, her throat tight with unshed tears and unspoken curses. The muteness that had been her shield in the wild was now her prison. She had 1,000 things to scream at him, 1,000 questions that burned like acid in her gut, but she was trapped in silence. As the spires of the capital city, Vaskengard, pierced the horizon, a wave of nausea rolled through her. The city of her youth, the city of her betrayal. The stone walls seemed to lean in, whispering of her shame. The guards at the gate stared, their eyes widening first at the king's unexpected return, and then at the disheveled, wild-looking woman riding in his procession, marked so clearly as his own. Whispers followed them like smoke through the cobbled streets, a rising tide of shock and speculation. The castle was worse. It was a fortress of memory and pain. Every tapestry-lined corridor, every vaulted ceiling held a ghost. Here was the alcove where Arendor had first kissed her, a secret, stolen moment that had felt like the beginning of the world. There was the grand hall where his younger brother, Haydn, had publicly renounced their secret betrothal, his voice dripping with contempt as he called her barren and unworthy. His words fed to him by the vipers on the council. She saw their faces in her mind. Malakor's smug satisfaction, the elders' cold approval. They did not take her to the dungeons. They took her to the heart of the royal wing, to a set of chambers so opulent they made her teeth ache. The doors were carved from white northern oak, inlaid with silver. Inside, a fire roared in a massive stone hearth, casting a warm glow over velvet couches, silken bed hangings, and tables laden with wine and fruit. It was a cage, but it was gilded beyond imagination. 2 young serving women, their faces a mask of nervous neutrality, entered behind her. "My lady," one of them murmured, her eyes fixed on the floor. "The king has ordered a bath prepared for you, and garments." Raisa stood frozen in the center of the room, the fine wool rug a strange, suffocating sensation beneath her bare feet. She looked down at herself, at the dirt-smudged linen dress, the grime under her fingernails, the twigs in her hair. She was a wild thing brought to heel, and they were going to wash the forest from her skin. The thought was unbearable. It was the last piece of her freedom, the scent of pine and damp earth. She gave a small shake of her head, a gesture of defiance. The lead servant swallowed nervously. "Please, my lady," the king was very specific. The unspoken threat hung in the air. Raisa's shoulders slumped. A fight over a bath was a battle she could not win. Wordlessly, she allowed them to lead her to the adjoining bathing chamber, a room of steam and heated marble. They helped her out of her ragged dress with hesitant, trembling hands, their eyes carefully avoiding the angry mark on her neck. As the old garment fell away, she caught her reflection in a polished silver mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back. Her face was thinner, her cheekbones sharper. Her eyes, once soft, held a haunted, feral quality. And there, stark against the pale skin of her throat, was the mark. It was a swirl of intricate lines, already healing into a deep crimson brand, the unique signature of Arendor's wolf. It pulsed with a faint inner light, a visible sign of the magic that now bound them. It was a brand of ownership, a claim, a warning. The hot water was a shock, a luxury her body had forgotten. As the maids gently washed her hair and skin, scrubbing away the grime of her exile, silent tears finally traced paths down her cheeks, lost in the scented steam. They were not tears of sorrow, but of helpless, burning rage. Each touch was a reminder of her captivity. Each stroke of the cloth was an attempt to erase the woman she had become, to reshape her into the queen he had declared her to be. When she was clean, they wrapped her in a robe of impossibly soft fleece and led her back to the main chamber. Laid out on the massive bed was a gown of deep forest green silk, so fine it seemed to flow like water. It was a beautiful, elegant prison. She put it on, the fabric cool against her feverish skin. The maids combed the tangles from her long, dark hair until it fell in a smooth curtain down her back. They offered her food, which she refused, and wine, which she ignored. Finally, they curtsied and backed out of the room, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence. She walked to the tall, arched window. It overlooked the central courtyard, the very place where she had been publicly shamed. Below, life went on. Guards patrolled, courtiers gossiped in small clusters, their quick, furtive glances up at her window, a clear sign that word had already spread. She was the beast brought back from the wild, the king's savage new pet. The door opened behind her. She didn't have to turn. The bond hummed with his proximity, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated deep in her bones. Arendor entered, closing the heavy doors with a soft, final click. He had changed out of his armor. He wore a simple black tunic and trousers, the dark fabric doing little to conceal the formidable breadth of his shoulders, and the raw power coiled in his frame. In his hand, he held a small ceramic pot. He walked towards her, his steps as silent as they had been in the forest clearing. He stopped just behind her, and for a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. "The green suits you," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It brings out the fire in your eyes." She flinched at the compliment, at the ghost of the boy who used to say such things. She turned slowly to face him, her expression a carefully constructed mask of cold fury. She would not let him see her fear. She met his gaze, pouring all her hatred, all her defiance, into that one look. His icy blue eyes swept over her, taking in the clean hair, the silk gown. A flicker of something, satisfaction, regret, crossed his face before it was gone. His gaze lingered on the mark on her neck. "It will be sore," he stated, his tone devoid of apology. It was a simple statement of fact. He stepped closer, and she instinctively stepped back. Her retreat halted by the cold stone of the window frame. She was trapped. "Do not pull away from me, Raisa," he warned, his voice soft but edged with steel. "Not now, not ever again." He raised the pot. "This is a salve, silver leaf and crushed moonstone. It will speed the healing and soothe the pain." She stared at his outstretched hand, then back at his face. She shook her head, a sharp, defiant gesture. She would accept nothing from him, not his comfort, not his pity, not his twisted version of care. She would wear his mark as a wound, a constant, painful reminder of what he had done. A dark look crossed his face. "This is not a request." He set the pot down and reached for her. She tried to duck away, but his reflexes were inhumanly fast. His hand cupped the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her clean hair, holding her still. His other hand tilted her chin up, forcing her to expose the mark to him. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating against the bars of a cage. She was completely at his mercy. He picked up the pot again and dipped 2 fingers into the cool, fragrant salve. His gaze held hers, unwavering, as he slowly, deliberately began to apply it to the wound he had created. The touch was electric. His calloused fingers were unexpectedly gentle against her savage skin. The salve was cool, instantly easing the burning ache. But the intimacy of the act was a new kind of torture. His thumb brushed along her jawline, his scent, pine, winter air, and the unique musk of his wolf, filled her senses, a scent she had once craved and now despised. A traitorous warmth spread through her veins, a primal response to her mate's touch that her conscious mind fought with every ounce of its will. She squeezed her eyes shut, unable to bear the intensity of his gaze. She felt the ghost of a touch, the whisper of his lips near her ear, though he hadn't moved. The bond was a live wire, transmitting the phantom sensations of his intent. "I know you hate me," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her skin. "You have every right. But you need to understand. My brother was a fool, ruled by the whispers of ambitious men. He was never strong enough to hold the throne, and he was never worthy of you." Her eyes snapped open. He spoke of his brother, the man he had presumably usurped, with such dismissive contempt. "Malachor and his ilk," Arendor continued, his fingers still gently tending to the mark. "They feared you. They feared the power your bloodline held. They feared what our union would create. They orchestrated your fall, Raisa. They fed Haydn lies, poisoned his mind against you until he saw you not as his mate, but as a threat to his claim." He finished applying the salve and slowly, reluctantly, pulled his hands away. The loss of his touch left her skin feeling cold and exposed. "They thought by casting you out, by silencing you, they had removed a piece from the board," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. His eyes were no longer chips of ice. They were burning with a cold silver fire. "They were wrong. They only put the queen into play." He stared at her silent, defiant face, at the lips that could not form a reply. A strange, almost pained expression crossed his features. "They took your voice," he said softly, a chilling statement of fact. He reached out, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. A touch so light it was barely there. "I will give you a crown. Let us see which is louder." Sleep was a shallow, restless sea. Raisa drifted in and out of it, pulled under by exhaustion, only to be thrown back to the surface by nightmares painted in fire and blood. Each time she woke, the first sensation was the silken unfamiliarity of the sheets against her skin, a suffocating softness after years of sleeping on a straw pallet and furs. The second was the bond. It was a constant low thrum beneath her skin, a phantom limb she was still learning to navigate. In the quiet of the pre-dawn hours, it was a clearer channel. She could feel Arendor, not his thoughts, but the deep underlying currents of his state of being. He was not sleeping. He was awake, somewhere else in the stone fortress, and the emotion radiating from him was a tightly coiled knot of frustration and a deep, wearying vigilance. When the serving maids entered with the morning light, they found her already awake, sitting in the high-backed chair by the window, staring out at the slate-gray sky. She was already dressed in the green silk gown from the night before. They curtsied, their movements timid and uncertain. "Your Majesty," one of them whispered, the title sounding clumsy and strange in the quiet room. "We have brought—" She gestured to the fresh set of clothes they carried, a gown of deep crimson velvet embroidered with silver thread. It was a queen's garment, heavy and imposing. Raisa looked at the dress, then at her own simple silk. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. She would not be a doll for him to dress. The green gown was his choice, but it felt less like a costume than the blood-red velvet. It was the color of the forest, the last vestige of the world he had stolen from her. The maids exchanged a panicked look. They did not press the issue, instead busying themselves with laying out a breakfast of warm bread, cheese, and sliced fruit. Raisa ignored it. The hunger in her belly was a dull, familiar ache, but the thought of accepting his sustenance, of taking comfort in this gilded cage, was nauseating. An hour later, a stern-faced guard in the king's personal livery appeared at her door. "The king requests your presence in the council chamber," he said, his voice a formal, impersonal baritone. He did not say commands, but the word hung in the air between them. This was it, then. The first test, the first parade of his new possession. With a surge of cold resolve, she stood. She would not be dragged. She would walk. She followed the guard through the winding, silent corridors. The castle staff they passed averted their eyes, flattening themselves against the walls, as if her presence might contaminate them. She was a pariah queen, a wild wolf brought into the heart of the flock. The doors to the council chamber were immense, carved with the history of the Vascan line. They swung open to reveal a room of cold stone and high, narrow windows. A long, dark wood table dominated the space, and seated around it were the members of the High Council. The same faces, the same cold, calculating eyes that had watched her fall. Lord Malachor sat at the head of the table, in the seat traditionally reserved for the king's hand, a position of immense power. His silver hair seemed to gleam in the thin morning light, and his expression was one of barely concealed contempt. Arendor stood at the far end of the room, before the hearth where a low fire burned. He was a pillar of black and gray, his presence so dominant it seemed to suck the very air and light towards him. His face was a mask of cold fury, his gaze fixed on Malachor. He didn't look at Raisa as she entered, but she felt the shift in his attention through the bond, a flicker of awareness that was as intimate as a touch. She stopped just inside the doorway, her back straight, her hands clasped before her. The guard closed the doors behind her, the sound echoing in the tense silence. "You were saying, Lord Malachor." Arendor's voice was deceptively mild, a low rumble that promised violence. Malachor's gaze flickered to Raisa, a sneer touching his lips before he masked it, with a veneer of concerned propriety. "Your Majesty, I was merely reminding the Council of tradition, of the law. A queen must be of pure blood, her lineage vetted, her worthiness confirmed by the elders. She cannot be a stray, dragged from the mud and branded on a whim. The pack will not accept it. It is a mockery of our most sacred rights." "The mark is the most sacred right," Arendor countered, his voice dropping an octave. "And my will is the law." "A mark given in force, without consent, without ceremony," Malachor pressed, emboldened by his own perceived righteousness. "The ancestors would weep. She is a disgraced Omega, cast out for treason. She is barren, wolfless. Enough!" The word was not shouted. It was a sliver of ice, driven into the heart of the room. The temperature seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Arendor took a single deliberate step forward, and every man at the table, including Malachor, flinched. "You will not speak of her again," Arendor snarled, his eyes beginning to bleed from icy blue to the glowing silver of his wolf. "You will not look at her. You will not think her name. She is your queen. The brand on her neck is my word made flesh. Do you understand me, Malachor?" Malachor's face had gone pale. The confident sneer was gone, replaced by a sheen of cold sweat on his brow. He had overplayed his hand, misjudging the depths of the new king's ferocity. I meant no disrespect to the crown, only to uphold. You have grown comfortable in my absence," Arendor continued, ignoring the interruption as he began to walk slowly along the side of the table, his movements fluid and predatory. "You and your cronies, whispering in my brother's ear, twisting the law to suit your ambitions. You thought with a puppet on the throne, you were the true kings of this land." He stopped directly behind Malachor's chair. He placed his hands on the high, carved back, his knuckles white. Malachor sat ramrod straight, not daring to move, not daring to breathe. "Those days are over," Arendor whispered, the sound carrying with terrifying clarity in the silent room. "This is my pack now, my kingdom, and that," he said, his silver gaze finally, fully locking with Raisa's across the room, "is my queen." The possessiveness in that statement was absolute, a physical force that struck her like a wave. The bond flared between them, hot and bright. In that moment, through the swirling currents of his rage, she felt something else aimed at her, a fierce, savage protectiveness that was as terrifying as his anger. He was a monster, but he was her monster. The thought was disorienting, horrifying. "The council is dismissed," Arendor said, his voice returning to a normal, commanding tone. He straightened up, his hands falling from the chair. The lords scrambled to their feet, their chairs scraping against the stone floor. They fled the room without a backward glance, their haste a clear sign of their terror. Only Malachor remained seated, for a moment, his pride warring with his fear. Then, with a visible effort, he pushed himself to his feet and walked stiffly from the room, his back rigid. He did not look at Raisa, but she felt the hatred rolling off him, a cold and venomous promise of future retribution. They were alone. The silence that descended was heavier than the one before. It was just the two of them, the crackle of the fire, and the loud thrumming hum of the bond connecting them. Raisa felt trapped, suffocated by the intensity of his emotions, by the sheer force of his will. She needed to escape. Without thinking, she turned and fled, not back to her chambers, but deeper into the castle, following the winding corridors of memory to the one place that had ever felt like a true sanctuary, the royal library. The doors were unlocked. She pushed them open and slipped inside, the familiar scent of old parchment, leather bindings, and beeswax washing over her. Sunlight streamed through the high arched windows, illuminating dancing motes of dust. It was just as she remembered it. A cathedral of silence and stories. For a moment, a painful ache of nostalgia pierced through her anger. This was where she and Arendor had met in secret, hidden in the alcoves, sharing stories from forbidden texts. Their hands brushing in the dusty twilight, she ran her fingers along the spines of the books. The worn leather a comforting texture. Her hand stopped on a slim volume bound in blue leather. Tales of the Star Wolves, a collection of ancient myths. A specific memory surfaced, sharp and painfully clear. Arendor, then just a boy of 17, reading a passage to her, his voice full of wonder, his eyes shining in the candlelight. A single hot tear escaped her and traced a path down her cheek. She wiped it away, furious at her own weakness. "That was always your favorite." His voice, coming from the doorway, made her jump. She spun around, clutching the book to her chest like a shield. Arendor stood there, silhouetted against the light of the corridor. He closed the doors softly behind him, enveloping them in the quiet intimacy of the library. He walked towards her, not with the predatory stride he'd used in the council chamber, but with a strange, almost hesitant gait. The fury had receded from the bond, replaced by that same deep, weary vigilance she had felt in the morning. "Why did you run?" he asked, his voice softer now. She could only glare at him, her throat tight. He stopped a few feet from her, a wry, humorless smile touching his lips. "Of course, why wouldn't you?" He ran a hand through his dark hair. a gesture of frustration that seemed utterly genuine. "Raisa, look at me." She forced herself to hold his gaze. His eyes were blue again, the silver wolf dormant for now, but they were troubled, shadowed with things she couldn't begin to comprehend. "What Malachor said," he began, then stopped, searching for the right words. "About the mark. He was right about one thing. It was an act of force. It was brutal. I did not give you a choice. Do you know why?" She gave a slight, bitter shake of her head. He took a step closer, the air between them crackled. "Because a choice is a luxury we no longer have. Because they are still trying to kill you." The statement was so blunt, so devoid of theatrics, that it struck her with the force of a physical blow. Kill her, she was a powerless, wolfless exile. What possible threat could she pose? As if hearing her unspoken question, he continued, his voice low and urgent. "They never stopped seeing you as a threat. Your bloodline, Raisa. The Dullen line is one of the oldest, said to be descended from the first moon-touched wolves. It carries a latent power that the Vascan line has always coveted and feared. My father's grandfather took a Dallin bride. It is why our family holds the throne, a union between us, between an alpha king and a Dallin wolf. It was a prophecy Malachor and the others were determined to prevent." He gestured to the book she was still clutching. "They are not just tales, there is truth in them." Suddenly the bond between them flared, not with anger, but with a wave of raw, undiluted emotion from him. It was a surge of profound grief, of soul-deep loneliness, so potent it made her gasp. It was the agony of 5 years spent alone, of battles fought in silence, of a crown that felt more like a curse. It was an involuntary confession, a crack in the iron wall of his control, and she saw him, truly saw him, for the first time since his return. Not a tyrant, not a monster, but a man drowning in the cage of his own making. He staggered back a step, his eyes wide, a look of shock and self-loathing on his face. He had not meant for her to feel that. He slammed his mental shields back into place, but it was too late. The secret was out. "They planned to kill you," he said, his voice rough, forcing the conversation back on track. "The night before your public rejection, I overheard them, Malachor and the elder Vareth. It wasn't enough to have you cast aside. They had arranged for a purification ritual, a ceremony to cleanse the pack of your unworthy blood." He looked at her, his eyes blazing with the memory. "It's an archaic, barbaric rite. They would have bled you onto the altar stone, and in front of the entire court, they would have severed your connection to your wolf, to your very soul. You would have died, Raisa, or you would have been left a hollow, mindless vessel. There was no time to fight them, no way to expose them without them killing you on the spot. Haydn was too weak, completely under their sway. He took a final step, closing the distance between them. He reached out, not to grab her, but to gently take the book from her nerveless fingers, setting it on a nearby table. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. His touch was warm, a stark contrast to the chilling horror of his words. "I had only one choice," he whispered, his gaze boring into hers, pleading for her to understand. "One move I could make that would get you out of this castle alive. I had to let them have their victory. I had to let my brother reject you. I had to let them cast you out, believing you were broken and worthless." He leaned his forehead against hers, his eyes closing for a moment in shared pain. "It was never a rejection, Raisa. It was an escape, and it was the hardest thing I have ever done." His words hung in the dusty air of the library, a truth so shattering it fractured the world Raisa had built around herself. The narrative of her life, a story of betrayal, abandonment, and survival, crumbled into dust. She had not been thrown away. She had been saved, and the price of her salvation had been his throne, his family, and 5 years of a brutal, solitary war. The monster who had dragged her from her home in chains was also the man who had secretly orchestrated her freedom. She pulled back from his touch, stumbling a step away. The proximity, the confession, the sheer overwhelming weight of it all was too much. She stared at him, at the jagged scar on his cheek, at the profound weariness in his eyes. This was not the boy from her memories, nor was it the cold tyrant from the clearing. This was a man forged in the crucible of impossible choices. The bond between them, which had been a channel for his rage and her defiance, now pulsed with a different, more complex energy. It was a conduit for 5 years of unshared pain. She could feel the echoes of his battles, the ghosts of men he'd cut down, the crushing loneliness of command. And beneath it all, the constant, unwavering ache of her absence. It was a wound in his soul that had never healed. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the dawning comprehension warring with years of ingrained hurt. He didn't press her, didn't demand forgiveness or understanding. He simply stood there, letting her process the new shape of their past. Malachor, Raisa managed, the name a harsh rasp from her throat. It was the first word she had spoken in 5 years. Her voice was a stranger to her own ears, thin and rough with disuse. But it was there. His confession had unlocked something, broken the seal on the trauma that had stolen her speech. Arendor's expression shifted, a flicker of raw emotion, shock, relief, something akin to reverence, crossing his face at the sound of her voice. "Yes," he said, his own voice thick. He believed my brother Haydn would be a weak king, easily controlled. He wanted the power behind the throne. But your lineage, combined with mine, would have created an heir of unprecedented strength. An alpha born of 2 ancient lines. It would have solidified the Vascan dynasty for centuries, beyond any council's influence. He couldn't allow it. "Haydn," she whispered, the name tasting like ash. "What happened to him?" A shadow passed over Arendor's face. He turned away from her, walking over to one of the high library windows and staring out at the gray stone of the courtyard. Malachor's influence over him was absolute. After you were gone, my brother became a paranoid, cruel ruler. He saw threats in every shadow. The kingdom suffered. The pack grew weak. 2 years ago, during the border wars with the feral clans, Haydn led a charge. It was reckless, a foolish attempt to prove his strength. Arendor's jaw tightened. He was cut down. Malachor's men were the first to retreat, leaving the king's flank exposed. It was convenient. He had not murdered his brother for the throne. He had inherited a broken kingdom from a brother who had been a pawn, sacrificed by the very man who now advised the new king. "After Haydn's death, I was the last of the Vascan line," Arendor continued, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The elders had no choice but to name me king. I have spent the last 2 years consolidating my power, rooting out the worst of the traitors, and preparing. I could not come for you until I was sure I could protect you, until I was strong enough to destroy them." He turned back to face her, his eyes blazing with a cold, righteous fire. "Bringing you back like this, marking you before the entire court. It was not just a claim, Raisa. It was a declaration of war. I have forced their hand. Malachor cannot move against me now without also moving against you, the queen I marked in full view of the pack. I have bound our fates together. His ambition will be his undoing." Raisa's mind reeled. It was a game of strategy, of power and sacrifice, played out across years, with her at the very center. She had been a piece moved across a board, first for her own protection, and now as a weapon. The thought should have angered her, but instead, a strange, terrifying sense of purpose began to bloom in the hollow space where her grief had lived. "You said they took my voice," she said, her voice stronger now, gaining confidence with each word. "You would give me a crown." "I will give you a sword, if you'll take it," he corrected softly. "I need more than a queen to stand beside me, Raisa. I need a partner, a warrior, the woman I always knew you were." The raw sincerity in his voice undid her. A sob, thick with 5 years of pain, tore from her throat. He was across the room in an instant, but he didn't touch her. He stopped just before her, his hands clenched at his sides, giving her space, letting her feel it all. "He called me barren," she choked out, the old humiliation surfacing, still sharp enough to draw blood. "Wolfless." "He was a fool repeating lies fed to him by our enemies," Arendor said, his voice a low, fierce growl. "Your wolf is not gone, Raisa. It is dormant. They tried to sever it, but the ritual was incomplete. They only managed to wound you, to silence it. I can feel it through the bond. It is still there, sleeping, waiting." He reached out then, slowly, giving her time to retreat. She didn't. His hand came to rest over her heart, his palm warm and solid against the silk of her gown. "We will wake her," he promised, "together." Over the next few days, the castle became a different kind of prison. It was no longer a place of isolated confinement, but a training ground. Arendor was true to his word. He did not treat her as a fragile prize, but as an ally. He spent hours with her in the library, poring over ancient texts, showing her the prophecies that spoke of their union, the lineage charts that proved the strength of her blood. He explained the complex web of allegiances and betrayals within the court, pointing out the faces of those loyal to Malachor and the few he tentatively trusted. He took her to the training yard, a place she had only ever watched from a distance. The scent of sweat, steel, and sawdust filled the air. He put a blade in her hand. It was lighter than she expected, perfectly balanced. "In the wild, you learn to survive," he said, circling her, his own practice sword held loosely in his hand. "Here, you will learn to fight." Her first attempts were clumsy. The muscles were there, honed by years of physical labor, but the instincts of a warrior were buried deep. He was a patient, demanding teacher. He corrected her stance, adjusted her grip, guided her through the basic forms. He never condescended, never treated her as the weaker sex. He treated her as a soldier. During one session, as she grew frustrated with her own awkwardness, he moved behind her. "You're thinking too much," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. He placed his hands over hers on the hilt of the sword, his chest pressing against her back. "Feel the balance. Let it become an extension of you." His body was a wall of heat and muscle behind her. His scent enveloped her. The bond between them flared, no longer just an echo of emotion, but a current of shared physical awareness. She could feel the ripple of his muscles as he guided her through a lunge, the steady beat of his heart against her spine. A jolt of pure, primal attraction shot through her, so potent it made her knees weak. It was a deeply buried memory, a physical echo of the love they had once shared, and it terrified her. She pulled away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I can't." His eyes softened, not with pity, but with understanding. "Yes, you can." He stepped back, giving her space. Again. She found her voice, and with it, a new kind of strength. She began to speak in the council meetings, which she now attended at Arendor's side. At first, her contributions were hesitant, quiet observations. But her 5 years in exile had given her a perspective the sheltered lords lacked. She spoke of the struggles of the common folk, of the forgotten territories in the north, of the simmering resentment in the outlying packs who felt abandoned by the capital. Malachor and his faction watched her with open hostility, but they could not silence her. She was the king's queen, her mark a blazing symbol of his authority. Her words, spoken with the quiet confidence of a survivor, began to sway the undecided members of the council. They saw not a broken Omega, but a woman of substance and unexpected wisdom. One evening, Arendor found her on the battlements, staring out at the rising moon. A cold wind whipped strands of her hair across her face. She had spent the day in a grueling session with the Master-at-Arms, her body aching with a satisfying burn. "You were magnificent today," he said, coming to stand beside her at the stone parapet. She looked at him, surprised. In the council meeting, Malachor had proposed a heavy new tax on the northern territories to fund the army. Raisa had spoken against it, calmly and logically explaining how it would cripple the very people whose loyalty they needed most. She had proposed an alternative, a restructuring of the royal trade tariffs. Her argument had been so sound, so well-reasoned, that the council had voted with her, handing Malachor a stunning and public defeat. "He underestimated you," Arendor said, a slow, dangerous smile on his lips. "They all did. That was always their mistake." "And you?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Did you underestimate me?" His smile faded. He looked out at the moon, his expression unreadable. "No," he said softly. "I knew exactly who you were. That's why I was so afraid." The confession hung between them, raw and vulnerable. He was afraid of her power, of the prophecy, of the depth of his own feelings for her. It was a truth that resonated deep within her soul. He turned to her, his eyes dark and intense in the moonlight. "Raisa," he began, his voice rough with an emotion he could no longer contain. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His touch was no longer just a guide or a comfort. It was a claim, filled with years of pent-up longing. "All this time, everything I have done." He stepped closer, his other hand coming up to cup her cheek. The scar on his face was a pale silver line in the moonlight. "It has always been for you." He leaned in, his intent clear. This was not the brutal possession of the claiming mark. This was not a strategic move on a political chessboard. This was Erindor, the boy she had loved, the man he had become, all of it converging in this one moment. Her heart hammered in her chest. A war raged within her, the ghost of her pain against the truth of his sacrifice, the instinct to flee against the undeniable pull of the bond of her own buried heart. His lips were about to touch hers when a sudden sharp pain lanced through her neck. She gasped, her hand flying to the claiming mark. It was burning, not with the heat of the bond, but with a cold, venomous fire. She looked at Erindor and saw a mirror of her own agony on his face as he clutched his own chest, his breath hissing through his teeth. The bond was screaming, not with passion, but with a warning. A deep, guttural growl ripped from Erindor's throat as his eyes flashed silver. "Poison," he snarled, his gaze snapping toward the shadows of the courtyard below. A sympathetic curse, keyed to the mark. Down below, a figure detached itself from the shadows of an archway and looked up. Even from this distance, there was no mistaking the smug, triumphant sneer on Lord Malacor's face. He gave a slight, mocking bow before melting back into the darkness. He hadn't needed to win in the council chamber. He had already set his true trap in motion. The cold fire of the poison spread with terrifying speed. It was a vicious, creeping ice that sank into Race's bones, seeking the very heart of the bond that tied her to Erindor. Her knees buckled, and he caught her, his own body rigid with pain, a low guttural growl rumbling in his chest. The world tilted, the stone battlement swimming before her eyes. Through the haze of agony, she could feel his struggle, his immense alpha power warring against the insidious magic, trying to shield her, trying to burn the curse out of their shared soul. "The old ways," he gritted out, his voice strained. He swept her into his arms, her weight nothing to him even as the poison worked its way through his own system. "He's using blood magic. It won't kill us, not directly. It's meant to sever, to break the bond." The implications were horrifying. Malachor wasn't just trying to assassinate them. He was trying to perform the very ritual he'd accused Erindor of mocking, to forcibly, magically reject her in a way that would not just break their connection, but shatter them both. For a king, losing a marked queen in such a way was a fatal blow to his authority and his spirit. For her, having the bond ripped away after it had been so violently reawakened would be a wound from which her soul might never recover. Erindor moved with a desperate urgency, striding through the castle corridors with her held tight against his chest. Guards and servants scattered before him, their faces masks of terror at the sight of their king, his eyes blazing silver, his face a taut mask of pain, carrying his stricken queen. "Get Marin," he roared, the command echoing off the stone walls. "Now!" He didn't take her to her opulent chambers. He took her to his own. The room was Spartan compared to hers, dominated by a massive hearth and a bed draped in dark furs. Maps covered a large oak table, and the scent of leather, iron, and his own unique musk clung to the very air. He laid her gently on the bed, his movements precise despite the tremors of pain racking his body. The mark on her neck felt like a shard of ice embedded in her flesh. The world was beginning to fade at the edges, the vibrant connection to Erindor growing thin and reedy like a distant scream. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of the poison. She reached for him, her fingers weakly clutching the front of his tunic. She couldn't lose him again, not now, not when she had just found him. His large, warm hand covered hers. "Stay with me, Raisa," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent rumble. "Do not let him win. Fight!" The doors burst open and an old woman hurried in, her face a web of deep lines, her gray hair in a tight, practical braid. She carried a leather satchel that smelled of dried herbs and earth. This was Marin, the pack's healer, her lineage stretching back further than the Vascan kings. Her sharp, intelligent eyes took in the scene at a glance, Raisa pale and shivering on the bed, the king standing over her like a wounded wolf guarding his den. "Blood curse," she stated, her voice calm and steady, a rock in the swirling chaos. "Keyed to the claiming mark, ambitious and foolish." "Can you break it?" Erindor demanded. Marin was already pulling small vials and pouches from her bag. "Break it? No, this magic is old, Your Majesty. It feeds on the bond itself. To break the curse, I would have to break the bond. That is what the caster wants." She looked from his tormented face to Raisa's, a deep understanding in her gaze. "But we can turn it. We can poison the poison. She crushed a dark, gnarled root into a stone bowl, adding a pinch of shimmering silver dust and a few drops from a dark blue vial. The mixture sizzled, releasing a sharp, clean scent like ozone and crushed mint. The curse is designed to find the weakest point in the bond and tear it apart, Marin explained as she worked. It expects a new mark, still raw, built on dominance and fear. It expects a resentful omega and a possessive alpha. She looked pointedly at Arendor. It does not expect a bond that was forged in love long ago and has been lying dormant. It does not expect a foundation of sacrifice. She brought the bowl to the bed. This will not be pleasant, my queen, she said, her voice softening as she addressed Raisa. I am going to place this poultice on the mark. It will amplify the connection, force open the pathways between you. Every ounce of his strength, his pain, his will, you will feel it as your own. And he yours. You must not fight him. You must accept it. You must accept him, fully. The curse seeks to divide you. Your only defense is to become one. Raisa looked at Arendor, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. To open herself completely to the force of his being, to the untamed wolf and the ruthless king. It was terrifying. But as she met his gaze, she saw no tyrant. She saw the man in the library, his soul bared, his heart scarred with the sacrifice he had made for her. She saw her mate. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. Hold her, Marin instructed Arendor. Ground her. She will need an anchor. Arendor sat on the edge of the bed, gathering her into his arms. He pulled her against his chest, her back to his front, his arms a cage of solid warmth and strength around her. He buried his face in her hair, his breath hot against her scalp. I am here, he murmured, the vibration of his voice traveling through her entire body. I will not let you go. Marin applied the poultice. It was not pain, it was dissolution. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of pure sensation and emotion. The walls of her own consciousness crumbled, and she was swept away into the vast, turbulent river of him. She felt the iron weight of his crown, the phantom ache of old battle wounds, the crushing responsibility for an entire kingdom. She felt the searing rage he held for Malachor, a righteous inferno that threatened to consume everything. But beneath it all, she felt the anchor, the one fixed point in his chaotic world, his love for her. It was a fierce, savage, and profoundly tender thing. A love that had survived betrayal, war, and 5 years of desolate silence. And he felt her. He felt the gnawing loneliness of her exile, the deep, aching grief of her perceived betrayal, the humiliation of her public shaming. He felt the fragile, flickering hope that had been born in the library, and the terror that it would be extinguished. He felt the silence of her dormant wolf, a hollow ache in the center of her being. The poison shrieked. It was a living entity within the bond, and it writhed and recoiled from the pure, unadulterated truth of their connection. It had come expecting a fractured, resentful union it could easily tear apart. It found an ancient, unbreakable knot, tempered by sacrifice and reforged in truth. Mine, his voice echoed, not in her ears, but in her soul. It was not a command, but a statement of absolute, undeniable fact. A promise. Yours, she answered, a silent surrender that was not a defeat, but a homecoming. A wave of brilliant silver light erupted from the mark on her neck. It was not the cold fire of the curse, but a warm, healing radiance. It flooded her veins, chasing the icy tendrils of the poison, burning them away to nothing. And as it did, it touched the cold, silent place within her where her wolf slept. A flicker, a warmth, a low, rumbling growl that was not Arendor's, but her own. The dormant power of the Dalen line, the magic that Malachor had feared for so long, stirred from its slumber. Awakened by the purity of the reforged bond and the catalyst of Marin's magic, her inner wolf opened its eyes. Power, raw and untamed, surged through her, the scent of ancient forests, the light of a primal moon, the strength of the earth itself. It met Arendor's own formidable power, not as a tributary to a river, but as a matching ocean tide. The entire room seemed to vibrate with the force of it. Marin stepped back, her eyes wide with awe. Arendor gasped against her hair, his arms tightening around her as he felt the staggering shift, the sudden, brilliant presence of her other half. The bond between them did not just heal. It transformed, expanding, deepening, becoming something more than a claiming mark, more than a fated connection. It became a conduit for two immense powers, intertwined and inseparable. The light faded. The pain was gone. A deep, profound peace settled in its place. Raisa lay in his arms, her body weak but her spirit soaring. She was whole again. She turned in his embrace to face him. His silver eyes were wide, filled with a wonder and adoration that stole her breath. He reached up, his fingers gently tracing the mark on her neck. It was no longer an angry red brand. The intricate lines now glowed with a soft silver light of their own, a living testament to the magic they now shared. "Your wolf," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. "She's awake," Raisa whispered, and for the first time she felt the truth of it. She could feel the powerful living presence within her, a comforting warmth and a fierce protective strength. The gravity of what they had just done, what Malachor had unwittingly forced them to do, settled over them. The king's gambit. Malachor had made his move, intending to remove the queen and cripple the king, but in doing so, he had healed her, awakened her, and forged their bond into a weapon of unimaginable power. He had not removed a piece from the board. He had just crowned her. Arendor lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers. The kiss he had been about to steal on the battlements was no longer necessary. They had shared something far more intimate, a bearing of souls more profound than any physical touch. "He doesn't know what he has unleashed," Arendor murmured, a low, dangerous smile gracing his lips. "He wanted to put out a spark. Instead, he has given me a wildfire." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his own glowing with resolve and a fierce, burning love. "It is time, my queen. It is time to show them why they were right to be afraid of you." The shift happened under the bone-white light of the full moon. It was not a ritual of the court performed on a cold altar stone before the prying eyes of the pack. Arendor took her deep into the royal wood, a vast, untamed wilderness that bordered the castle grounds, a place where the trees were ancient and knew the secrets of the old magic. Marin came with them, not to officiate, but to witness. Raisa stood in a small, moon-drenched clearing, the damp earth cool beneath her bare feet. She wore a simple linen shift, the finery of the court left behind. For the first time in 5 years, she did not feel the hollow ache of her wolf's absence. Instead, she felt a thrumming, joyful energy building within her, a wild song her blood had forgotten how to sing. Arendor stood before her. He was not a king in that moment, but an alpha, his own power, a tangible presence in the air, a low hum of protective energy that wrapped around her. "You do not need to be afraid," he said, his voice a low murmur that was for her alone. "She knows the way home. Just let go." She closed her eyes and did as he said. She let go of the pain, the fear, the years of believing she was broken. She reached inward, not with her mind, but with her soul, calling to the magnificent silver-pelted wolf she had only seen in her dreams. The change was not the agony of bone and sinew being ripped apart that she had been taught to expect. It was a release. It was an unfolding, a becoming. A surge of power, warm and bright, coursed through her. She felt her senses expand, the world exploding into a symphony of new information. The scent of pine sap and damp moss was a complex tapestry. She could hear the frantic heartbeat of a field mouse 100 yards away, the whisper of the wind through the highest branches. When she opened her eyes, the world was sharper, painted in shades of silver and deep shadow she had never seen. She was lower to the ground, her body a vessel of coiled muscle and effortless grace. She looked down and saw not hands, but paws, tipped with formidable claws, covered in a coat of fur the color of moonlight and ash. She was beautiful, she was powerful, she was whole. A joyous howl, pure and unrestrained, burst from her throat, a sound of reclamation that echoed through the ancient trees. Across the clearing, an answering howl rose to meet hers, a deep, resonant baritone of an alpha welcoming his mate home. Arendor stood in his own wolf form, a massive creature of midnight black, his silver eyes glowing with pride and love. They ran. For hours they raced through the moonlit forest, a blur of silver and black. It was a dance of pure, unadulterated freedom. She had forgotten the sheer exhilaration of it. The wind in her fur, the earth flying beneath her paws, the perfect silent communication with her mate. They moved as one, anticipating each other's every turn, their shared bond a living, breathing thing that connected them more deeply than words ever could. This was what Malachor had feared. Not just a queen, but an alpha female of a powerful ancient line, mated to the king. It was a balance of power the kingdom had not seen in centuries. They returned to the castle just before dawn, shifting back to their human forms in the privacy of Arendor's chambers, the exhilaration of the run still singing in their veins. As Rhaesa stood, breathless and naked, her human skin tingling with the lingering magic of the change, Arendor crossed the room and pulled a thick fur robe around her shoulders. His touch was reverent, his eyes full of an emotion so profound it made her heart ache. "I knew you were still in there," he whispered, his hand cupping her cheek. "I never stopped looking for you." This time, when he leaned in to kiss her, she did not hesitate. She met him halfway, her hands coming up to tangle in his dark hair. The kiss was not the desperate, frantic claiming of a stolen moment. It was a slow, deep exploration, a conversation 5 years in the making. It was a kiss of forgiveness, of understanding, of a love that had been tested by fire and betrayal and had emerged stronger than steel. It was the sealing of a promise, the final, irrevocable joining of two halves of a single soul. The following day, the court was in an uproar. Word of Malachor's failed magical assault had spread like wildfire, though the official narrative, spun by Arendor's loyal spy master, was that the queen had been the victim of a sudden, violent illness from which she had miraculously recovered. But the whispers knew better. They saw the new light in the queen's eyes, the way the king never strayed more than a few feet from her side, the palpable aura of power that now radiated from them both. They saw it most clearly in the next council meeting. Rhaesa entered the chamber at Arendor's side. She was not wearing the velvet and silk of a courtly queen. At her own request, she was dressed in supple, dark leather, expertly tailored, a warrior's attire. Her newly awakened senses were a formidable weapon. She could smell the sour tang of fear on 2 of the lords, allied with Malachor, hear the accelerated heartbeat of another as she met his gaze. Malachor was there, his face a perfect mask of calm concern, but Rhaesa could sense the seething frustration beneath the surface, the confusion at how his perfectly executed plan had not only failed, but seemed to have made his enemies stronger. The meeting began with mundane matters of state, but the tension was a coiled serpent in the room. Finally, Arendor brought the true agenda to the fore. "Lord Malachor," he began, his voice deceptively calm, "the council thanks you for bringing the matter of the northern tax to our attention. Her Majesty's insightful alternative has already proven beneficial. However, it has brought another issue to my mind, the issue of loyalty." He rose from his throne and began to pace, his movements a slow, deliberate circle, like a wolf stalking its prey. For too long, this court has been riddled with factions, with men who put their own ambition before the good of the pack, who whisper poison into the ears of their kings. His gaze fell on Malachor, hard as granite. "Who conspire to harm the queen." A collective gasp went through the room. It was one thing to whisper of such things in the corridors. It was another to have the king declare it before the entire High Council. Malachor rose to his feet, his face a picture of outraged innocence. "Your Majesty, this is an outrageous accusation. I have served the Vascan line my entire life. To suggest I would harm Her Majesty is a slander of the highest order." "Is it?" Rhaesa's voice cut through his blustering defense. It was not loud, but it carried a new authority, a resonance of power that made every man at the table turn to look at her. She remained seated, her hands resting calmly on the table before her. "You speak of slander, my lord," she said, her eyes locking with his. "Let us speak of treason. Let us speak of a lord who conspired with the elder Vareth to perform a forbidden ritual upon an innocent girl 5 years ago, a ritual designed to sever her from her wolf and her soul." The color drained from Malachor's face. Vareth, an ancient, withered lord sitting further down the table, made a small choking sound. "How could you possibly know of such a thing?" Malachor stammered, his composure finally cracking. "It is a lie, a fantasy." "Is it?" Rhaesa asked again, a slow, dangerous smile touching her lips. "I can smell the lie on you, Lord Malachor. It is a bitter, cloying scent, just as I can smell the residue of the blood curse you cast. It clings to you like a shroud." The other lords stared at her, their expressions a mixture of fear and awe. an alpha female, a queen who could scent lies, who could feel the stain of dark magic. She was something from the old legends. Arendor stopped his pacing directly behind Malachor. "You orchestrated my brother's death," he stated, his voice a low, deadly growl. "You left his flank open in the battle against the feral clans." "Never," Malachor spat, spinning to face the king. "I was forced to pull my men back. We were being overrun." "Another lie," Rhaisa said calmly. "My time in the northern wilds was informative. The exiles and outcasts you also readily dismiss, they see things, they talk. They remember the day Lord Malachor's banner was the first to flee the field, long before the king's guard was broken." Checkmate. Malachor was trapped, exposed by the king's power and the queen's unique knowledge. His carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. In his eyes, the mask of the refined courtier fell away, revealing the rabid, cornered wolf beneath. "You!" he snarled, his face contorting in a mask of pure hatred as he pointed a trembling finger at Rhaisa. "This is all your doing. The moment you came to this court, you were a disease. A poison that turned a prince against his own family." With a guttural roar, he lunged, not at Arendor, but at her. He was a powerful wolf in his own right, and his speed was immense, but he had forgotten who he was facing. Arendor moved like lightning, his hand shooting out to catch Malachor by the throat, lifting him clear off the ground. But before he could crush the life from him, Rhaisa was on her feet. "No," she said, her voice ringing with command. "He is mine." She walked around the table, her movements fluid, graceful, and utterly menacing. She stopped before the sputtering, choking lord, whose face was rapidly turning purple in Arendor's grip. She looked into his hate-filled eyes, and for the first time, she felt no fear, only a cold, clean fire. "You called me Baron," she said, her voice soft. "But our line will sit on this throne for 1,000 years. You called me wolfless, but my wolf will hunt in the dreams of your descendants. You sought to erase me, Malachor, but you have only succeeded in making me eternal." She looked at Arendor. "Let him go." He hesitated, his protective instincts warring with his trust in her. With a final contemptuous shove, he threw Malachor to the stone floor. The disgraced lord landed in a heap, gasping for air. "Guards!" Arendor roared. The chamber doors flew open and a dozen of the king's elite guards stormed in. "Seize him! Seize Lord Vareth! Their titles are forfeit. Their lands are forfeit. Take them to the black cells. They will await their trial for high treason." As the guards hauled the two struggling lords away, a stunned silence fell over the remaining council members. They looked from their furious king to their serene, terrifyingly powerful queen. The old order was broken. A new one had just begun. Arendor came to her side, his hand finding hers, their fingers lacing together. He looked out at the pale, shaken faces of his council. "There is a new age upon this kingdom," he declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "An age of truth, an age of strength, an age of two wolves, united as one. You will serve the pack. You will serve the crown, both crowns." He raised their joined hands. "And you will remember this day, the day the embers of the old world were finally swept away to make room for the fire that is to come." Years passed. The kingdom, once fractured and weak, was forged anew under the dual reign of its king and queen. The court, cleansed of its deepest corruption, learned a new kind of loyalty, one born not of fear, but of respect. Arendor ruled with a warrior's strength and a strategist's mind, but it was Rhaisa who gave his reign its soul. She, who had lived as an outcast, never forgot the common folk. She established trade, rebuilt the northern territories, and created a system of justice that valued truth over lineage. Her voice, once stolen, became the voice of the voiceless. They had children, a son with his father's dark hair and his mother's silver eyes, his wolf a perfect fusion of their two ancient lines. Then a daughter, wild and free-spirited, her laughter echoing in the stone halls that had once held so much pain. The prophecy Malachor had feared came to pass, but it was not a curse. It was a blessing that secured the kingdom for generations to come. One cool autumn night, Rhaisa and Arendor stood on the high battlements of the castle, the same spot where the poison had nearly torn them apart. Below, the city of Vaskengard was alive with the warm lights of hearth fires and the distant sounds of a prosperous, peaceful people. Rhaisa leaned against her husband, her head resting on his shoulder. He wrapped a strong arm around her, pulling her close. The bond between them was no longer a tumultuous current, but a deep, calm, and fathomless ocean. It was a constant, comforting presence, the bedrock of their lives and their reign. "Do you ever miss it?" Arendor asked quietly, his gaze on the dark line of the royal wood in the distance. "The silence? The freedom of the wilds?" Raisa considered the question. She thought of her small cabin, of the scent of pine and river water, of the simple, solitary peace she had fought so hard to build. It was a part of her, a memory etched into her soul, but it was no longer her whole story. "I am freer now than I ever was then," she answered, her voice soft. "Freedom isn't being alone, Arendor. It's being truly seen." He turned, his hand cupping her chin, and tilted her face up to his. The scar on his cheek was a faint silvery line now, a testament to the battles he had fought to bring them here. His eyes, the color of the summer sky, were filled with a love that had weathered every storm. "You were always my queen, Raisa," he murmured, "even when you were in exile, even when I thought I had lost you forever. You were the northern star I steered by." He kissed her, a gentle, familiar kiss filled with the quiet comfort of shared years, and a love that had been reforged into something unbreakable. As they stood together under the vast, star-dusted sky, they were not just a king and queen, an alpha and his mate. They were two souls who had been torn apart by the cruelty of the world, only to find their way back to each other, burning away the past to build a future from the ashes. They had been claimed by force, but they were bound by a love that had proven stronger than any crown, any curse, or any chain. And in that love, they had found their true kingdom,